Sarah Mitchell walked into the crowded coffee shop on a busy Tuesday morning, unaware that her life was about to change forever. The small coastal town of Newport had always been her refuge, a place where she could blend into the background and live quietly. At 32 years old, Sarah had learned to keep her head down and avoid drawing attention to herself. She wore a simple navy blue dress that day, modest and unremarkable, except for one detail that always caught people's eyes. On her left shoulder, partially visible beneath the sleeve of her dress, was an intricate tattoo. The design was unusual, a combination of military symbols that most people didn't recognize. It featured an eagle with spread wings, crossed anchors, and a distinctive trident symbol, all rendered in bold black ink with precise detail. As Sarah waited in line to order her usual coffee, she noticed the familiar pattern beginning to unfold around her. First came the stares. A group of young women in designer workout clothes glanced her way, their eyes immediately drawn to her tattoo. Their whispered conversation carried just loud enough for Sarah to hear snippets of their judgment. "Look at that thing on her arm," one of them said, wrinkling her nose in disgust. "Why would anyone put something so ugly on their body? Probably thinks it makes her look tough," another added with a dismissive laugh. "Some people have no class." Sarah's cheeks flushed red, but she remained silent. This wasn't the first time her tattoo had drawn negative attention, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. She pulled her cardigan closer around her shoulders, trying to hide the artwork that meant more to her than these strangers could ever understand. Behind the counter, the young barista, a college student named Jake, rolled his eyes as he took her order. "Large coffee." "Black," Sarah said quietly. Jake barely looked at her as he scribbled on the cup, but when he glanced up and saw her tattoo, his expression changed to one of obvious disapproval. "That's some serious ink you got there," he said with a smirk. "Let me guess, you're trying to be some kind of rebel?" Sarah handed him her money without responding, but she could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. The coffee shop seemed to grow quieter, as if everyone was listening to the exchange. She could sense the judgment emanating from the other customers, their unspoken assumptions about who she was and what her tattoo represented. An elderly man sitting at a nearby table shook his head in disapproval. "In my day, women didn't mark up their bodies like that," he muttered to his wife. No respect for themselves. The morning crowd was typical for this part of town. Young professionals on their way to office jobs, retirees enjoying their daily social hour, and college students grabbing caffeine before classes. Most of them lived comfortable lives, far removed from the realities that Sarah had experienced. They saw her tattoo and made assumptions based on their limited understanding of the world. Sarah moved to the side to wait for her coffee, trying to make herself invisible. She pulled out her phone and pretended to read messages, anything to avoid the continued stares and whispered comments. The tattoo on her shoulder seemed to burn under their scrutiny, even though she knew the judgment was unfair. A woman in an expensive business suit leaned over to her friend. "I don't understand why people do that to themselves. It's so unprofessional. She'll never get a decent job looking like that." The friend nodded in agreement. "My daughter wanted a tattoo once. I told her over my dead body. Thank goodness she listened." Sarah bit her lip, fighting back the urge to defend herself. These people had no idea what her tattoo meant, what it represented, or why she carried it with such pride despite their criticism. They saw only the surface, the black ink on her skin, and made judgments based on their own narrow perspectives. The barista called out her order with obvious disinterest. "Large black coffee for the lady with the interesting artwork." His tone dripped with sarcasm, and several customers chuckled at his comment. Sarah approached the counter to collect her drink, her face burning with embarrassment. She could feel dozens of eyes on her as she reached for the cup. "Thanks," she whispered, taking the coffee and turning toward the door. But as she moved through the crowded shop, she accidentally bumped into a man who was reading a newspaper at a small table. Coffee splashed from her cup, creating dark spots on the floor. "I'm so sorry," Sarah said quickly, grabbing napkins from a nearby dispenser. "Let me clean that up." The man looked up from his paper. and Sarah found herself staring into kind, intelligent eyes. He appeared to be in his 40s, with graying hair and a calm demeanor that stood out in the bustling coffee shop. He was dressed simply in jeans and a polo shirt, nothing that would normally draw attention. "No harm done," he said with a gentle smile. "Accidents happen." As Sarah bent down to clean up the spilled coffee, her cardigan slipped slightly, revealing more of her tattoo. The man's eyes fell on the design, and for a moment, his expression changed. Unlike the others in the coffee shop, he didn't look disgusted or judgmental. Instead, his face showed something closer to recognition, followed quickly by what appeared to be deep respect. "Miss," he said quietly, his voice taking on a different tone. "That tattoo. May I ask where you got it?" Sarah looked up from where she was kneeling on the floor, surprised by the serious nature of his question. Around them, the coffee shop continued its busy morning rhythm, but she sensed something important in this man's interest. It's a long story," she said hesitantly, standing up with the soiled napkins in her hand. The man studied her face carefully, and she could see him processing something significant. His next words were spoken so quietly that only she could hear them. "That's not just any tattoo," he said. "Those symbols. They mean something very specific." Sarah's heart began to beat faster. Most people saw her tattoo and saw only rebellion or poor judgment. This stranger seemed to understand that there was more to the story. She glanced around the coffee shop, aware that several people were still watching their interaction with curiosity. "I should go," she said, suddenly feeling overwhelmed by the attention and the man's intense scrutiny. "Wait," he said, standing up from his table. "I think we should talk. My name is Commander David Harrison, and if that tattoo means what I think it means, then I owe you more than just an apology for this spilled coffee." The word commander hung in the air between them. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. Around them, the other customers had grown quiet, sensing that something significant was happening but not understanding what. The same people who had been mocking her tattoo just minutes earlier now watched with growing confusion. The businesswoman who had criticized her appearance leaned forward in her chair, straining to hear the conversation. The elderly man who had disapproved of her body art squinted at them with curiosity. Commander Harrison's recognition of her tattoo had shifted something fundamental in the atmosphere of the coffee shop. The casual cruelty and quick judgments of the morning were being replaced by a tension that no one quite understood. Sarah stood frozen, holding her coffee cup, aware that her carefully guarded secret was about to be revealed to a room full of strangers who had already decided who she was. The tattoo on her shoulder, the one that had brought her nothing but shame and ridicule in this small town, was about to tell a story that none of these people were prepared to hear. Commander David Harrison studied Sarah's face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a crucial puzzle. The coffee shop around them had grown unnaturally quiet, with conversations dying mid-sentence as customers sensed the gravity of the moment without understanding its significance. "Please," Harrison said, gesturing to his table. "Sit with me for a moment." Sarah hesitated, glancing around at the watching faces. The same people who had been whispering cruel comments about her tattoo were now listening intently, their curiosity overriding their earlier disdain. She sat down across from the commander, her hands trembling slightly as she placed her coffee cup on the small table. "That design on your shoulder," Harrison said, keeping his voice low but clear enough that nearby customers could hear. "It's not something you see every day. In fact, it's not something most people would ever see at all." The young barista, Jake, had stopped cleaning and was openly staring at their table. The group of women in workout clothes had abandoned their conversation entirely, straining to hear every word. Even the elderly couple had turned their chairs to get a better view of the unfolding scene. "Those symbols," Harrison continued, "the eagle, the anchors, the trident. They're not random military designs. They're very specific. They represent the Naval Special Warfare Command." A murmur rippled through the coffee shop. Several people pulled out their phones, no doubt looking up what the commander had just said. Sarah felt her throat tighten as she realized where this conversation was heading. "But more than that," Harrison said, his voice growing stronger. "The way they're arranged, the specific details in the artwork. That's the unofficial emblem of SEAL Team 6. the most elite special operations unit in the United States military. The coffee shop erupted into whispered conversations. People were Googling frantically, trying to understand what they were witnessing. The businesswoman who had criticized Sarah's professionalism was staring with her mouth slightly open. The elderly man who had expressed disapproval of her tattoo was leaning forward with intense interest. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of years of hidden pain and secret pride. When she opened them, she found Commander Harrison watching her with deep respect. "That tattoo," he said quietly, "is not something you get at a parlor downtown. It's not something you choose because you think it looks cool. There's only one reason someone would have that exact design permanently marked on their body." He paused, allowing his words to sink in throughout the coffee shop. Jake had completely stopped pretending to work and was standing behind the counter with a dish rag in his hand, staring at Sarah as if seeing her for the first time. "That tattoo," Harrison continued, "belongs to the widow of a Navy SEAL." The silence that followed was deafening. You could hear the hum of the espresso machine and the distant sound of traffic outside. But inside the coffee shop, no one spoke, no one moved. The weight of understanding was settling over the crowd like a heavy blanket. Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. For 3 years, she had lived in this town, enduring the stares, the comments, the judgment. People saw her tattoo and assumed she was trying to look tough, trying to be rebellious, trying to make some kind of statement about herself. None of them had ever considered that it might represent something sacred. "Tell me about him," Commander Harrison said gently. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper when she began to speak, but the coffee shop was so quiet that everyone could hear her clearly. "His name was Marcus," she said, her fingers unconsciously touching the tattoo on her shoulder. "Marcus Reed. We met when I was 25. Just out of graduate school, he was stationed in San Diego, home on leave." She paused, struggling to find the words to explain a love that had been both intense and brief. "People always ask what it's like to love someone in the military," she continued. "But loving a SEAL is different. You know every time they leave that they might not come back. You know they're going places they can't tell you about, doing things they can't explain. You learn to live with a kind of fear that becomes part of your daily routine." The group of women who had been mocking her earlier were now listening with expressions of growing shame and regret. One of them had tears in her eyes. "Marcus was deployed 6 months after we got married," Sarah continued. "It was supposed to be a routine mission. That's what they always say. Routine. But there's nothing routine about what these men do." Commander Harrison nodded slowly. As a military officer himself, he understood the weight of those words in ways that most civilians never could. "We had been married for 11 months when I got the visit," Sarah said, her voice growing steadier as she shared her story for the first time in years. "2 officers at my door in dress uniforms. You know, when you see that, you know what they're going to tell you. But somehow, your mind refuses to accept it." The elderly man who had earlier criticized her tattoo was now staring at the table, his face flushed with embarrassment. His wife had reached over to take his hand, both of them clearly struggling with the realization of how wrong their assumptions had been. "Marcus died serving his country in a classified operation," Sarah continued. "I can't tell you where, because I don't know. I can't tell you exactly what happened, because that information is still classified. What I can tell you is that he died doing what he believed in, protecting people, like all of you." She looked around the coffee shop, making eye contact with the people who had been so quick to judge her. "After the funeral, Marcus's team leader came to see me. He told me about this tattoo. He said it was something the wives sometimes got, a way to carry their husbands with them. He said Marcus would want me to be proud of who he was and what he stood for." Commander Harrison was nodding throughout her story, clearly familiar with the traditions she was describing. "So I got the tattoo," Sarah said, rolling up her sleeve to show the full design. Every line, every symbol, placed exactly as it should be. "It hurt like hell, but not as much as losing Marcus. And I've worn it every day since, even though most people look at it and see something ugly." The barista, Jake, was staring at her with an expression of complete mortification. The casual cruelty of his earlier comments now seemed unforgivably ignorant. Around the coffee shop, people were looking down at their hands, clearly struggling with their own guilt over their quick judgments. "I moved to this town because I needed to start over," Sarah continued. "I needed somewhere quiet where I could figure out how to live without him. But everywhere I go, people see this tattoo and make assumptions. They think I'm trying to be tough, or rebellious, or that I'm some kind of problem." She laughed bitterly. "If they only knew that I got this tattoo because I wanted to honor the gentlest, bravest man I've ever known." Marcus never raised his voice to me, never said an unkind word to anyone. He just believed that some things were worth fighting for. Commander Harrison reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. "He was right," he said firmly. "And you're right to honor him." The coffee shop remained silent as Sarah's story sank in. The casual Tuesday morning had become something much more significant. People who had started their day with routine errands and mindless chatter were now confronting their own capacity for cruelty and misjudgment. "I'm sorry," came a quiet voice from across the room. It was one of the women in workout clothes, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry for what we said." Other voices began to join in, a chorus of apologies and expressions of regret. But Sarah held up her hand, stopping them. "You didn't know," she said simply. "How could you know? People see what they see and make assumptions. It's human nature." Commander Harrison looked around the coffee shop at the faces surrounding them. "But maybe," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "this could be a reminder that we never really know what someone else is carrying. We never know what their story is." The morning crowd nodded in agreement, many of them clearly struggling with the weight of their own behavior. The elderly man stood up slowly and approached their table. "Young lady," he said, his voice shaky with emotion, "I owe you an apology. And more than that, I owe your husband my thanks." Sarah looked up at him, seeing the genuine remorse in his eyes. "We all do," he continued, looking around the coffee shop. "All of us owe him our thanks." But Commander Harrison wasn't finished with his revelation. As the morning crowd struggled to process what they had learned, he was studying Sarah's tattoo with the trained eye of someone who understood military symbolism at the deepest level. "Sarah," he said quietly, "there's something else about your tattoo that I need to tell you. Something that makes this story even more significant than you know." Commander Harrison's words hung in the air like an unfinished sentence. Sarah looked at him with confusion, unsure what more there could be to discover about the tattoo she had worn for 3 years. Around them, the coffee shop crowd leaned in closer, sensing that another revelation was coming. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. Commander Harrison studied the intricate design on her shoulder with renewed intensity. "The details in this tattoo," he said slowly, "they're not just the standard SEAL Team 6 emblem. Look here." He pointed to a small section of the design, where tiny numbers were barely visible among the scrollwork. Sarah looked down at her own arm, squinting at the area he indicated. She had never paid close attention to those particular details, trusting the artist who had created the piece according to the specifications given to him by Marcus's team leader. "Those numbers," Harrison continued, "they're coordinates. But not just any coordinates. They mark the location of a specific mission that took place 2.5 years ago." The coffee shop had grown so quiet that the sound of Harrison's phone buzzing on the table seemed loud. He glanced at it quickly, then returned his attention to Sarah's tattoo. "I need to make a phone call," he said, standing up from the table. "Don't go anywhere, please." As Harrison stepped outside to take his call, the coffee shop crowd remained frozen in place, watching Sarah as if she were a puzzle they couldn't solve. The barista, Jake, approached their table hesitantly. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with shame, "I want to apologize for what I said earlier. I had no right to judge you." Sarah nodded, accepting his apology but still focused on trying to understand what Commander Harrison had seen in her tattoo that she had missed. The design had been created exactly as specified by Marcus's team, but apparently there were details she had never fully understood. Other customers began approaching her table, each offering their own apologies. The businesswoman who had criticized her professionalism came over with tears in her eyes. "I'm so ashamed of what I said," she whispered. "My own brother is in the military, and I should have known better." The elderly couple walked over together, the man's face red with embarrassment. "Young lady, we've been coming to this coffee shop for 15 years, and this is the most important lesson we've ever learned here. Your husband was a hero, and you're carrying his memory with honor." But even as she accepted these apologies, Sarah's mind was focused on Commander Harrison's mysterious phone call. Through the window, she could see him speaking intently with someone, occasionally looking back at her through the glass. When he returned to the coffee shop 10 minutes later, his expression was grave. He sat down across from her and took a deep breath before speaking. "Sarah, I need to ask you something important. What was the exact date of Marcus's death?" "March 15th, 2022, she replied without hesitation. The date was burned into her memory forever. Commander Harrison nodded slowly. "And the mission he died on. Were you ever told any details about what happened?" "Only that it was classified," Sarah said. "They told me he died serving his country, that he saved lives, but that the specifics would probably never be declassified." Harrison was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see him wrestling with some internal decision. Finally, he spoke. "Sarah, I just spoke with my superior officer. The coordinates embedded in your tattoo, they mark the location where Marcus died, but more than that, they mark the location of one of the most significant rescue operations in recent military history." The coffee shop crowd pressed closer, hanging on every word. 2.5 years ago, Harrison continued, a humanitarian aid convoy was captured by terrorists in a remote region. 12 aid workers, including 3 American doctors, were being held hostage. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and intelligence suggested the hostages would be executed within hours. Sarah felt her heart racing. This was more information about Marcus's final mission than she had ever received. "A SEAL Team 6 operation was authorized to rescue those hostages," Harrison said. "It was an incredibly dangerous mission, deep in hostile territory, with minimal backup. The team knew it was essentially a suicide mission. But they went anyway, because 12 innocent lives hung in the balance." He paused, looking directly into Sarah's eyes. "Marcus was the team leader on that mission." Gasps echoed throughout the coffee shop. People were crying openly now, understanding that they were hearing about genuine heroism, not the Hollywood version they were used to seeing in movies. "The mission was successful," Harrison continued. "All 12 hostages were rescued and returned safely to their families. But during the extraction, Marcus's team came under heavy fire. He made the decision to stay behind, to ensure the hostages and his team members could escape safely." Sarah's hands were shaking as the full picture of her husband's final moments began to emerge. "Marcus held off the enemy forces for 17 minutes, Harrison said, his voice filled with respect. 17 minutes that allowed everyone else to reach safety. The last radio transmission from him was to confirm that the hostages were secure. The silence in the coffee shop was absolute. Even the background music seemed to have stopped. "But here's what makes this even more significant," Harrison continued. "One of the doctors that Marcus saved that day was Dr. Jennifer Chen, a pediatric surgeon. After she was rescued, she returned to the United States and continued her work. Over the past 2 years, she has performed life-saving surgeries on over 200 children." He let that number sink in before continuing. "Another rescued hostage was Michael Rodriguez, an engineer who was working on water purification systems in refugee camps. Since his rescue, he has completed projects that provide clean water to over 50,000 people." Sarah was crying now, overwhelmed by learning that Marcus's sacrifice had rippled outward in ways she had never known. The third American hostage was Dr. Sarah Williams, an infectious disease specialist. She has since led efforts to combat malaria outbreaks that have saved an estimated 1,000 lives. Commander Harrison reached across the table and took Sarah's hands in his. "Your husband didn't just die serving his country. He died saving lives that went on to save thousands more lives. The coordinates in your tattoo don't just mark where he fell. They marked the spot where one man's courage changed the world. The coffee shop erupted into spontaneous applause. People were standing, clapping, crying, and looking at Sarah with expressions of awe and respect. The same tattoo that had brought her mockery and judgment an hour earlier was now revealed as a marker of extraordinary heroism. "There's more," Harrison said, raising his hand to quiet the crowd. "The mission Marcus led has been classified until now, but it's being considered for declassification specifically so that his story can be told. The families of the people he saved have been asking for permission to honor him publicly." He pulled out his phone and showed Sarah a series of messages. "While I was outside, I received calls from Dr. Chen, Michael Rodriguez, and Dr. Williams. They've been searching for you for 2 years, wanting to thank you and tell you how Marcus's sacrifice changed their lives." Sarah stared at the messages, seeing pictures of the people Marcus had died to save, reading their words of gratitude and requests to meet her. "They want to create a foundation in Marcus's name," Harrison explained. "A foundation that supports the families of fallen special operations soldiers and funds humanitarian aid work around the world." The elderly man who had criticized her tattoo was now standing at attention, as if he were saluting. Other customers were doing the same, creating an impromptu ceremony of respect in the middle of a coffee shop. "But perhaps most importantly," Harrison said, "they want the world to know that the young woman who walks among us every day, enduring judgment and cruelty because of her tattoo, is carrying the memory of one of our nation's greatest heroes." He stood up and addressed the entire coffee shop. "This woman has been living in your community for 3 years. She shops in your stores, walks your streets, drinks coffee in your cafe, and every day she has endured your stares, your comments, your assumptions about who she is." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "But she never complained, never defended herself, never tried to make you understand what her tattoo really meant. She simply carried her grief and her pride in silence, honoring her husband's memory in the face of ignorance and cruelty." The barista, Jake, stepped forward. "Ma'am, from now on, your coffee is free here. Forever. It's the least we can do." The businesswoman who had criticized her professionalism was pulling out her business card. "I work for a non-profit organization," she said. "We want to help with the foundation. We want to be part of honoring your husband's memory." Similar offers began coming from around the coffee shop. The elderly couple wanted to make a donation. College students wanted to volunteer. Everyone wanted to do something to make up for their earlier behavior and to honor Marcus's sacrifice. But Commander Harrison held up his hand again. "The most important thing you can do," he said to the crowd, "is remember this day. Remember what you learned about making assumptions. Remember that every person you meet is carrying a story you know nothing about." He turned back to Sarah. "And you," he said gently, "need to stop hiding. The world needs to know your story. Not just Marcus's story, but yours. The story of a woman who has carried grief and pride with equal grace. The story of a love that continues even after death." Sarah wiped the tears from her eyes and looked around the coffee shop at the faces surrounding her. An hour ago, these people had seen her as someone to mock and dismiss. Now they understood that she was someone to honor and respect. "I've been hiding for 3 years," she said quietly. "Maybe it's time to stop." Commander Harrison smiled. "Marcus would be proud of you. For the way you've honored his memory, for the strength you've shown, and for the grace with which you've endured judgment from people who didn't understand." As the morning crowd began to disperse, each person stopped to speak with Sarah, to apologize, to express their respect, or to ask how they could help honor Marcus's memory. The coffee shop that had been filled with casual cruelty an hour earlier was now united in purpose and humility. The tattoo on Sarah's shoulder, the one that had brought her nothing but pain in this small town, had finally told its true story. And in telling that story, it had changed not just how people saw her, but how they saw the world around them. Marcus Reed had died saving lives in a distant land. But on this Tuesday morning in a small coffee shop, his memory had saved something else entirely. It had saved a community's capacity for compassion, understanding, and respect. And it had finally allowed his widow to step out of the shadows and into the light of the recognition she had always deserved.